Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Climate Catastrophe Theory and the era known as the Golden Noon. Imagine the world 3,200 years ago. We are stepping back to the year 1200 before Common Era. The air is thick with the scent of wild thyme and the faint salt spray of the Mediterranean Sea. The sun is a heavy, golden coin hanging in a sky so blue it feels infinite. Close your eyes and feel that warmth against your skin. This was a time when the world felt complete, as if the structures of man were as eternal as the stars themselves. The great palaces of the Mycenaean kings stood white and gleaming atop the rugged hills of Greece, their walls built by giants, or so the legends would say. In the east, the sprawling city of Hattusa, the heart of the Hittite Empire, pulsed with the rhythm of copper and bronze. To the south, the Nile flowed like a green ribbon through the golden sands of Egypt, where the pharaohs sat on thrones of gold and lapis lazuli. It was a world of absolute order, a shimmering peak of human achievement that we now call the Golden Noon. At this specific moment in history, the great powers did not exist in isolation. They were bound together in a beautiful, delicate web of diplomacy and brotherhood. The kings of these vast empires called each other brother in their letters, etched in wedge-shaped cuneiform upon tablets of clay. They exchanged gifts of immense value, gold from the mines of Nubia, fine purple linens from the Phoenician coast, and horses of the finest pedigree. There was a sense of shared destiny among the elite, a belief that the prosperity of one was tied to the prosperity of all. This was the first truly globalized economy. Imagine the bustling ports of Ugarit or Gaza, where the languages of a dozen nations mingled in the marketplace. You can hear the low murmur of merchants haggling over the price of grain, the rhythmic thud of mallets in the shipyards, and the gentle lapping of the water against the wooden hulls of the great merchant vessels. The world was small enough to be known, yet large enough to be wondrous. Every horizon held the promise of trade, and every ship brought stories from lands beyond the setting sun. Consider the cargo of one of these ancient ships, navigating the treacherous currents along the coast of Anatolia. Below the deck, nestled in the hold, are ingots of copper shaped like the hides of oxen, heavy and cool to the touch. Beside them lie small, precious bunks of tin, brought from mines so distant they seemed like myths. When melted together, these two metals gave birth to the age itself, the bronze that formed the swords of heroes and the plows of farmers. There were also jars of fragrant resin, beads of amber from the cold northern seas, and delicate vessels of cobalt blue glass that caught the light like captured pieces of the ocean. The artisans of this time possessed a mastery that seems almost supernatural to us now. They carved ivory with the precision of a heartbeat and wove textiles so fine they felt like a second skin. Everything was connected. A drought in the fields of the Hittites could be felt in the counting houses of Egypt. A disruption in the tin trade could silence the forges of Mycenae. Yet, in the height of the Golden Noon, such disruptions seemed impossible. The system was too grand, too well-oiled, and too permanent to ever truly break. The people of 1200, before Common Era, moved through their lives with a rhythm dictated by the seasons and the gods. In the temples, the smoke of frankincense rose in steady spirals toward the rafters, carrying the prayers of priests who had watched the same constellations for 1,000 years. There was a profound sense of security in the architecture of the time. The walls were thick, the granaries were full, and the lineage of kings stretched back into the mists of the past. It was a time of monumental building, colossal statues that stared out across the desert and palaces with intricate frescoes depicting dolphins leaping through waves of turquoise. The climate was kind, the rains were predictable, and the earth seemed to offer its bounty without hesitation. This was the pinnacle, the moment when the sun stood directly overhead, casting no shadows. But it is the nature of the noon to eventually give way to the afternoon, and for the shadows to begin their slow, inevitable crawl across the dry dirt. Even the most eternal structures have a shadow that grows as the light shifts. Yet, even in this era of brilliance, the first whispers of the coming catastrophe were beginning to stir, though few were quiet enough to hear them. It started not with a roar, but with a subtle shift in the wind. The breezes that once brought the cooling moisture of the sea began to turn dry and hot, carrying the fine, red dust of the deep desert. In the highlands, the mountain springs that had fed the great cities began to trickle rather than flow. The farmers, squinting against a sun that felt just a fraction more cruel than the year before, noticed the soil cracking beneath their sandals. The harvests were still coming, but they were lighter, and the stalks of grain were a little thinner. In the great libraries of the palaces, the scribes continued to record the successes of their kings, but perhaps their hands trembled slightly as they noted the rising price of wheat. The interconnectedness that had been the world's greatest strength was quietly becoming its greatest vulnerability. Like a house of cards built on a foundation of shifting sand, the empires of the golden noon were standing on the precipice of a change they could not imagine. We leave the world now in its final moments of light. The great kings sit on their thrones, the ships are in the harbors, and the gold still gleams in the sunlight. But the air is changing. The golden age is beginning to tarnish, and the long, cold shadow of the collapse is stretching out from the horizon. As we drift further into this story, we will see how the very environment that nurtured these civilizations began to turn against them. For now, let the image of the Mediterranean at noon linger in your mind. The blue water, the white stone, and the silence of a world that does not yet know it is about to fall. Breathe in the scent of the ancient world one last time. We are standing at the end of the beginning, and the darkness is waiting just out of sight. Rest your mind in the warmth of the sun, for the journey ahead will lead us through the dust and the drought of the long night. Let the peacefulness of this ancient noon carry you into a deep and restful sleep. The golden glow of the late Bronze Age did not vanish in a single night of fire and steel. It began, instead, with a whisper of wind that carried no scent of moisture. If you were standing on the marble balcony of a palace in the year 1200 before the Common Era, you might have noticed a slight change in the light. The sun seemed a fraction more relentless, the horizons a bit more hazy with fine, pale dust. The air was beginning to lose its softness. For centuries, the rains had been a reliable heartbeat, a steady drum that dictated the rhythm of planting and harvest. But that heartbeat was slowing, growing faint and irregular. We are looking back now through the eyes of the earth itself, searching for the first forensic clues of a world that was literally drying up from the inside out. This was the beginning of the thirsty earth, a period where the very ground beneath the feet of kings began to surrender its life. To find the evidence of this ancient distress, we must travel deep beneath the surface of the Sea of Galilee. There, scientists have drilled 18 meters into the dark, silent sediment, pulling up long tubes of mud that serve as a vertical library of time. Each layer of silt represents decades of history, and within those layers, buried like microscopic fossils, are pollen grains. These are the fingerprints of the past. When researchers examined these grains from the period roughly 3,200 years ago, they found a chilling story written in the dust. The pollen of the great Mediterranean forests, the sturdy oaks, the fragrant pines, and the lush carob trees, began to vanish. These were trees that required steady, predictable rainfall. Their sudden absence from the geological record tells us that the sky had closed its gates. In their place, the pollen of desert shrubs and thistles began to dominate, blooming in the void left by the dying woods. The forensic trail does not end in the mud of the lake. It leads us also into the damp, echoing darkness of Sarek Cave. Here, stalagmites grow with agonizing slowness, stone by stone, drop by drop. Each thin layer of calcite traps oxygen isotopes that act as a chemical thermometer and a rain gauge for the ancient world. When we analyze the layers corresponding to the end of the Bronze Age, the chemical signature shifts dramatically. It reveals a sharp drop in annual precipitation that was not merely a brief drought, but a fundamental shift in the atmosphere. The storms that once rolled in from the Atlantic, crossing the Mediterranean to water the fields of the Levant, were being diverted far to the north. The moisture was there, but it was being pulled away by unseen hands in the sky, leaving the great empires of the south to bake under a sky of brass. In central Anatolia, at the heart of the mighty Hittite Empire, the juniper trees have kept their own record. Within the Midas Mound at Gordian, researchers have studied the rings of ancient logs used to build burial chambers. Tree rings are usually generous, wide bands that speak of seasons of plenty. But as the clock approached the 1200-year mark, the rings began to crowd together, becoming so narrow they were nearly invisible. Between the years 1198 and 1196 before the Common Era, the trees barely grew at all. For 3 consecutive years, the drought was so absolute that the sap almost stopped flowing. Imagine a landscape where the grass turned to straw by mid-morning, where the rivers were reduced to strings of muddy pools, and where the majestic juniper trees stood like gray ghosts, gasping for a drink that would not come for generations. This was the onset of a megadrought that would haunt the eastern Mediterranean for over 150 years. It was a slow-motion catastrophe, a creeping hunger that wore down the resilience of even the most sophisticated societies. In the coastal cities of Cyprus and Syria, the salt lakes began to shrink, losing their connection to the sea as the water evaporated and the levels plummeted. The marine plankton that once thrived in these lagoons began to die off, replaced by species that could endure the rising salinity. Every forensic marker we find, from the deep-sea cores to the mountain caves, points to the same conclusion. The environment was no longer a silent backdrop to the drama of human history. It had become the lead antagonist. The thirsty earth was waking up, and it was demanding a price that the Bronze Age kings could not afford to pay. As the rainfall patterns shifted, the very foundation of civilization, the surplus of grain that fed the armies and the scribes, began to crumble. We can almost feel the texture of the dry soil in the hands of a farmer 3 millennia ago, watching his olive trees wither and his wheat turn to dust before it could even sprout. The forensic evidence tells us that this was not a temporary misfortune, but a permanent change in the world they knew. The great machine of international trade, the ships laden with copper and tin, the ivory and the gold, all rested on a bed of stable climate. When that bed was pulled away, the entire structure began to groan. The silence of the dying forests was merely the prelude to the noise of the coming storm, as the people of the thirsty earth began to look toward the horizon for a way to survive. Can find the most haunting evidence of this slow-motion disaster in the archives of a city that was once the beating heart of the world's trade. Imagine, if you will, the coast of modern-day Syria, where the Mediterranean Sea licks against the white stone ruins of a place called Ugarit. 3,000 years ago, this was the switchboard of civilization. It was a cosmopolitan metropolis where merchants from Greece, Egypt, and Mesopotamia walked through streets that smelled of cedar wood, expensive perfumes, and drying fish. But as the centuries of the Bronze Age drew to a close, those bustling streets began to echo with a different sound. The frantic scratching of a reed stylus against wet clay. The people of Ugarit were a literate, record-keeping society, and as the climate turned against them, they began to document their own demise with a precision that still feels shockingly modern. Among the most significant discoveries in these ruins was the archive belonging to a man named Ertnu. He was not a king, but a high-ranking official and a merchant whose home sat near the southern edge of the city. In the quiet, dusty remains of his house, archaeologists found hundreds of clay tablets that had survived for over 3,000 years. These are the letters from the ash. When you hold the thought of these tablets in your mind, try to imagine their texture. They are small, often no larger than a modern smartphone, yet heavy and cool to the touch. Each one is covered in tiny, wedge-shaped marks that represent the world's first true alphabet. In the early years of Ertenu's archive, the letters are mundane. Trade agreements for copper, wood shipments, and polite diplomatic greetings. But as we move toward the final year, approximately 1185 before the Common Era, the tone shifts. The polite diplomatic language begins to crack under the weight of a growing, desperate hunger. The drought was no longer a distant rumor or a seasonal inconvenience. It was an existential threat. One of the most striking letters comes from the great king of the Hittites, Suppiluliuma II. He was the ruler of a massive empire in what is now Turkey, a superpower of the ancient world. Yet, in his letter to the king of Ugarit, his voice sounds small and strained. He writes of a famine so severe that it is consuming his people from the inside out. He demands that Ugarit send shipments of grain immediately, using a phrase that translates with chilling clarity. It is, he says, a matter of life or death. The Hittites, who once commanded thousands of chariots, were reduced to begging their vassal state for a few boatloads of wheat. You can almost hear the wind whistling through empty granaries as you read those words, a silent witness to a world where the earth had simply stopped giving. But Ugarit had its own tragedies to manage. The last king of the city was a young man named Amurapi. He was ruling at a time when the entire international system was fracturing. In the Akkadian language used for diplomacy, the word for hunger is buru, and it begins to appear with terrifying frequency in his correspondence. Amurapi wrote to the pharaoh of Egypt, pleading for grain to save the citizens of his land. He wrote to the king of Cyprus, whom he addressed as my father, describing how the enemy's ships were already appearing on the horizon. The tragedy of these letters is their timing. We see the king of Ugarit reaching out into a dark and empty room, calling for help from allies who were themselves on the brink of collapse. The pharaoh sent some grain, but it was like trying to put out a forest fire with a cup of water. The climate catastrophe had created a domino effect, and the first tiles were already falling. In the final weeks of the city, the correspondence takes on a cinematic quality. There is one tablet, found near the palace entrance, that describes 7 enemy ships appearing off the coast. The letter explains that the city's own army and navy were away, sent north to help the Hittites in a futile attempt to hold back the tide of invaders. This left Ugarit completely defenseless. The king's words are haunting. Behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. This was not just a military invasion. It was a migration of desperate, hungry people, driven from their own homes by the same drought that was starving Ugarit. Historians call them the Sea Peoples, but to the young King Amurapi, they were simply the end of his world. He was writing to anyone who would listen, but the network was already dead. The couriers were no longer arriving, and the ships were no longer bringing news, only fire. There is a deep, poetic irony in how these letters reached us. Under normal circumstances, unfired clay tablets are fragile. They can crumble if they get wet or are handled too roughly. They were never meant to last 3,000 years. But when the invaders finally breached the walls of Ugarit, they set the city ablaze. The intense heat of the fires that destroyed the palaces and the merchant houses acted as a kiln. It baked the clay tablets, turning them into stone-hard records that could withstand the passage of millennia. The very fire that ended the civilization is what preserved its final, frantic cries for help. Archaeologists found these tablets buried under layers of ash and fallen stone, exactly where they had been dropped by scribes who were likely running for their lives. The silence that followed the burning of Ugarit lasted for thousands of years, but the messages were there, waiting in the dark, telling the story of a world that starved before it burned. As we look at these tablets today, we see more than just ancient history. We see the record of a society that was highly interconnected, incredibly advanced, and yet utterly dependent on a stable environment. The kings of the Bronze Age thought their treaties and their gold would protect them, but you cannot negotiate with a dry sky. The letters from Ugarit show us that the collapse wasn't a single event, but a series of desperate choices made by people who were running out of time. They sent letters that no one could answer and ships that never returned. In the flickering light of those final fires, the era of the great chariot kingdoms came to a close, leaving behind only the scorched earth and these small, hard pieces of clay. The voices of Amurapi and Urtanu are still there, etched into the stone, reminding us of how quickly a golden age can turn to ash when the rains fail and the granaries run dry. Imagine, if you will, the Mediterranean at the end of the 13th century before the Common Era. The water is a deep, tranquil sapphire, and the air carries the scent of salt and sun-baked stone. For centuries, this sea had been a highway for luxury. It was a place where cedar from Lebanon met the gold of Egypt, where the fine pottery of the Mycenaeans traveled to the courts of the Hittites. But now, something is changing. The horizon is no longer clear. A new presence is beginning to flicker against the setting sun. At first, the coastal villagers might have thought they were looking at a mirage, a trick of the heat. But as the weeks passed, the smudges on the water grew into distinct silhouettes. These were the sails of 1,000 ships, drifting like a dark veil across the sea. This was the arrival of the mysterious confederation we now call the Sea Peoples. For generations, history books painted them as a tidal wave of bloodthirsty pirates, appearing out of nowhere to burn the world to the ground. But as we sit here in the quiet of the night, we can look closer at the evidence and see a story that is much more tragic and much more human. The name Sea Peoples actually comes from the frantic records of the ancient Egyptians. About 1175 years before the Common Era, the great pharaoh Ramses III looked out from his palace and saw his world under siege. On the massive stone walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, he carved the story of his struggle. The inscriptions describe a coalition of northern countries, nations with names that sound like echoes from a lost world. The Peliset, the Tejeker, the Shekelesh, and the Denian. Ramses claimed they were a conspiracy of islands, a force that had already laid waste to the great Hittite Empire and the Kingdom of Cyprus. He described them as a flame sweeping across the earth, unstoppable and merciless. When you look at the carvings on those temple walls today, you see a chaotic tangle of ships and warriors. You see men wearing distinctive feathered headdresses and carrying straight, long swords. The Egyptian artists captured a sense of panic, a world where the very foundations of civilization were being torn apart by these invaders from the deep blue. But if you let your eyes wander away from the warriors in those ancient reliefs, you will notice something that doesn't fit the narrative of a simple invasion. Tucked away in the carvings of the land battles are images of heavy, wooden ox carts. These carts are not carrying weapons or soldiers. Instead, they are filled with household goods, with supplies, and most tellingly, with women and children. Soldiers do not typically bring their entire families and their slow-moving livestock into the heat of a frontline battle. This single detail, carved into the stone over 3,000 years ago, changed everything for modern historians. It suggests that these people were not just an army on the march, they were a population on the move. They were families who had packed up their entire lives, leaving behind their ancestral homes in the Aegean and Anatolia. They were not looking for glory or gold. They were looking for a place to survive. They were the first major climate refugees of the ancient world, driven from their lands by a catastrophe they could neither understand nor overcome. What could have been powerful enough to displace tens of thousands of people and send them drifting across the sea in desperation? The answer lies hidden in the earth itself, in the tiny, invisible records of the environment. Scientists have recently turned to palynology, the study of ancient pollen, to reconstruct the climate of the late Bronze Age. By drilling deep into the sediment at the bottom of the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, they have extracted cores that act as a timeline. These cores show a sudden and terrifying shift around 1,200 years before the Common Era. The pollen from lush oak and pine trees, which had flourished for centuries, suddenly vanishes. In its place, we see a surge in the pollen of desert plants and hardy shrubs. It was a megadrought, a period of extreme aridity that lasted for nearly 300 years. In the Sarak Cave in Israel, the growth rings of ancient stalagmites tell the same story. Year after year, the rains simply stopped coming. The grain failed in the fields, the wells ran dry, and the vibrant gardens of the Mediterranean turned to dust. The great heat had arrived, and it was the invisible enemy that truly broke the back of the empires. As the famine took hold, the social order began to fracture. Imagine being a farmer in the Northern Islands, watching your children grow thin as the sky remains a heartless, cloudless blue for a decade. When the grain ships from Egypt stopped arriving and your local lord could no longer provide for you, the only choice left was to take to the sea. This is the true origin of the Sea Peoples. They were a symptom of the climate collapse, not the cause. They were a desperate tide of humanity pushed forward by the same environmental pressures that were already weakening the great kings of the East. As they moved south, they became a rolling wave of displacement. Each group they displaced joined the migration, creating a domino effect that surged toward the last remaining bastions of wealth and water. The shadow on the water was not a shadow of malice, but a shadow of hunger. The conflict we see on the temple walls was a collision between those who still had food and those who were starving. It was a struggle for the very right to exist in a world that was rapidly becoming uninhabitable. By the time the Sea Peoples reached the shores of Egypt, they were an exhausted, diverse confederation of the displaced. Though Ramses III claimed a total victory, boasting that he had slaughtered them like birds in a net, the reality was more complex. Many of these groups, like the Peliset, eventually settled in the coastal regions, becoming the Philistines of historical memory. They did not just disappear, they merged into the landscape, bringing their culture and their desperate resilience with them. As we reflect on this tonight, let the image of those drifting ships settle in your mind. The Bronze Age didn't just end with a bang of a sword against a shield. It ended with the quiet, persistent creaking of those ox carts and the soft lapping of waves against the hulls of migrant boats. The climate had changed the rules of the world, and everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the most powerful pharaoh, had to face the consequences. The empires were falling, and the dawn of a new, darker age was just beginning to rise over the horizon. Rest now and let these ancient echoes drift away, for the shadows of the past are long, but they are far from us tonight. High on the central plateau of what we now call Turkey, the wind whispers through the jagged limestone of the Anatolian heartland. This was the seat of the Hittite Empire, a superpower that once challenged the pharaohs of Egypt for the very soul of the ancient world. At its center stood Hattusa, a city of stone and secrets, perched on a landscape of steep ravines and soaring peaks. Its walls were massive, built to withstand the might of any army, but they could not hold back the invisible enemy that was slowly creeping across the sun-drenched earth. The Hittites were a people of grain and iron, their survival tied to the rhythm of the rains and the fertility of the soil. As we look back through the layers of time, we see a world that was not just falling to the sword, but one that was quietly withering away under a sky that had forgotten how to weep. The most profound evidence of this slow collapse is not found in the broken shards of pottery or the ruins of palaces, but in the microscopic life of trees. In the nearby region of Gordian, archaeologists discovered ancient juniper logs buried deep within a massive burial mound. These trees, which lived for centuries, held a silent record of every season they endured. When researchers examined their rings, they found a chilling story written in the wood. Toward the end of the 12th century before the Common Era, specifically between the years 1198 and 1196, the rings became so narrow they were nearly invisible. For 3 consecutive years, the rains failed completely. In a semi-arid landscape, a single year of drought is a hardship. 2 years is a crisis. 3 years, however, is a catastrophe that breaks the spine of a civilization. The trees were gasping for moisture, their growth stunted, reflecting a world where the wheat fields were turning to dust and the rivers were shrinking into muddy pools. In the heart of Hattusa, the Hittite kings had prepared for lean times with monumental ambition. They built subterranean grain silos of staggering size, one of which was as large as a modern football field. These massive underground chambers, divided into 32 separate compartments, were designed to hold hundreds of tons of barley and wheat, enough to feed the city and its armies through the longest winters. But as the sun beat down year after year, these silos became a haunting symbol of the empire's vulnerability. Excavations have revealed a desperate shift in how these spaces were used. In the final years, the once bursting reserves were empty. The tax collectors, who had once gathered grain from every corner of the realm, found nothing but scorched earth. We can imagine the dusty silence of those massive vaults, the smell of dry earth where there should have been the sweet, heavy scent of harvested grain. The empire's wealth was not in its gold, but in its bread, and the bread was gone. The historical record hums with the frantic energy of a king who knew the end was near. Suppiluliuma II, the last great ruler of the Hittites, sent out a series of increasingly desperate letters that have survived on clay tablets. He wrote to his vassals in Ugarit and even to the pharaohs of Egypt, pleading for shipments of grain to be sent immediately. In one haunting message, he described the situation in his lands as a matter of life and death. He was not talking about a war or an invasion. He was talking about the simple, primal hunger of his people. The king of the Hittites, a man who claimed to be the equal of the sun itself, was now a beggar at the gates of his neighbors. These letters were often found baked into the ruins of the cities they were sent to, preserved by the very fires that would eventually consume the Bronze Age world. They are the echoes of a voice crying out in a wilderness of drought. As the hunger deepened and the social fabric of the empire began to fray, a strange and quiet transformation took place within the walls of Hattusa. For decades, historians believed the city was sacked by a barbarian horde, but recent archaeological work suggests something much more eerie. The evidence shows that the royal family, the high priests, and the administrative elite did not wait for the end to come. They packed their most sacred records, their most portable treasures, and the statues of their gods, and they simply walked away. They abandoned their capital, leaving behind a ghost town of empty temples and silent palaces. There are no mass graves in the streets, no piles of unburied dead from a final siege. Instead, there is the sense of a grand stage where the actors have all departed, leaving the lights on and the doors unlocked. The city was not taken. It was surrendered to the silence of the plateau. When the fire finally came to Hattusa, it found a hollow shell. Sometime in the early 12th century before the Common Era, the royal acropolis and the great temple were set ablaze. The heat was so intense that the limestone walls were scorched, and the wooden beams were turned to charcoal. It is likely that local raiders or disgruntled remnants of the population eventually put the city to the torch, perhaps out of anger or a desire to erase the symbols of a government that could no longer feed them. But because the city had been largely emptied of people and valuables, the fire was more of a funeral pyre than a massacre. The flames licked the empty thrones and the vacant altars, turning the grandest capital of the ancient world into a monument of ash. The smoke would have been visible for miles across the parched landscape, a signal to all who watched that the age of the Hittites had come to a close. The great drought had finished what the politics of the palace could not, leaving only the wind to howl through the empty streets. As we leave the charred ruins of the Hittite capital, we travel south, following the ancient trade routes that once pulsed like golden veins toward the shimmering Mediterranean. The air here should be thick with the scent of salt and cedar, but in the early 12th century before the Common Era, the breeze carried only the dry, biting taste of dust. We are descending upon the Levantan coast, a stretch of land that served as the world's most vibrant crossroads. Imagine the harbor of Ugarit as it once was, a cosmopolitan jewel where merchants from Egypt, Cyprus, and the distant Aegean once bartered in a dozen different tongues. But tonight, the docks are silent. The great merchant ships, laden with blue glass and copper ingots, have stopped appearing on the horizon. The global economy of the Bronze Age is not merely slowing down. It is being strangled by a silence that begins at the shore and moves inward, like a rising tide of ash. If you were to stand on the Tell of Ugarit today and look beneath the surface, you would find a physical manifestation of this catastrophe. Archaeologists speak of it with a certain reverence and dread. It is known as the destruction layer. It is a thick, unmistakable band of black soot and gray ash that cuts through the soil like a scar. In some places, this layer is nearly half a meter deep, a silent testimony to a fire so intense it turned the very limestone of the palaces into powder. This was not a slow decay. This was a city that died in a single afternoon. Beneath the debris, excavators found a collection of clay tablets, some still sitting in the kilns where they were being baked for strength. These letters were never sent. They are the last, desperate echoes of a king named Amurapi, who wrote to his allies that the enemy ships were already visible, that his own troops were away in the north, and that his land was being consumed by flames. The cessation of trade was the final blow to a system already weakened by the climate. For decades, the rains had been failing. Modern scientists, peering through microscopes at pollen cores taken from the bottom of the Sea of Galilee, have found the ghosts of trees that tell a story of profound suffering. They see the sharp decline of the great oak and pine forests that once covered the hills, replaced by the hardy, drought-resistant olive tree. This was a 300-year drought, a relentless heat that withered the grain in the thrashing floors and turned the fertile valleys into cracked, barren earth. When the fires finally reached the coast, they found a population that was already starving. The complex supply chains that brought tin from the mountains of modern Afghanistan and copper from the mines of Cyprus had collapsed. Without trade, there was no bronze. Without bronze, there was no defense. The tools of civilization were literally melting away in the heat. As we move further south along the burning coast, we witness the same pattern repeated with haunting precision. At Hazor, the city that was once the head of all the kingdoms in the region, the fire reached such temperatures that the basalt statues in the temples literally exploded. The archaeological record shows that the public buildings, the storehouses of the elite, were targeted with a specific, focused rage. We see layers of burnt wheat, charred into tiny black pebbles, still sitting in the jars where it was stored 3,200 years ago. This wheat was precious, a hoard of survival in a time of famine, yet it was left to burn. It tells us that the attackers were not just interested in plunder. They were dismantling the very infrastructure of the state. The smell of burning cedar, once the most expensive building material in the ancient world, would have hung over the coast for weeks, a funeral pyre for the old world order. At Lachish, the destruction was so absolute that the site was abandoned for nearly 300 years. Think of the silence that follows such a catastrophe. The great ports that once saw hundreds of ships a month were now home only to the wind and the waves. The loss of literacy followed the loss of trade. When the palaces burned, the scribes who kept the records of the grain and the gold vanished, and with them, the memory of how to manage a kingdom. The burning coast was no longer a bridge between empires. It had become a wall of smoke. The people who survived these fires were forced into the highlands, leaving behind the ruins of their coastal glory to find water in the hills. They left behind a world that had been more interconnected than any would be again for 1,000 years. A world that fell not to a single enemy, but to the combined weight of a changing sky and a failing harvest. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well. The air in the Nile Delta is thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and the sweet, decaying musk of papyrus reeds. Imagine yourself standing on the muddy banks where the great green sea meets the river's many mouths. It is the 8th year of the reign of Pharaoh Rameses III, roughly 1175 before the Common Era. While the rest of the Mediterranean world is already smoldering in ruins, Egypt remains a defiant island of order in a sea of chaos. But even here, the silence of the afternoon is deceptive. The horizon to the north is no longer a clear line of blue. It is flickering with the jagged silhouettes of thousands of sails. The sea peoples have arrived, and they have not come for gold alone. They have come for the land itself, driven by a climate that has turned their homelands into dust and their children into ghosts of hunger. These invaders were a confederation of the desperate, the Peliset, the Tejeker, the Shekelesh, and the Denian. We know their names because Rameses had them carved deep into the stone walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. Unlike the professional armies of the past, these fleets carried more than just warriors. The reliefs show massive, heavy-wheeled ox carts pulled by teams of 4. Inside these carts sat women and children, clutching their meager belongings. This was a migration of entire nations, a human tide pushed forward by a centuries-long drought that had broken the back of the Hittite Empire and scorched the plains of Anatolia. For these people, Egypt was the last green place on earth. They moved with the terrifying momentum of those who have nothing left to lose, their bird-headed ships gliding toward the delta with a singular, lethal purpose. Rameses III was a man who understood the weight of his legacy. He knew that if the delta fell, 3,000 years of civilization would vanish into the silt. His defense was not merely a matter of brute force. It was a masterpiece of tactical deception. First, he engaged their land forces at Jahi, along the eastern frontier. He described his chariotry as a flame and his soldiers as a wall of metal. But the true test would be on the water. The sea peoples were masters of the open Mediterranean, their deep-hulled ships designed for the rolling waves of the sea. Rameses knew his own navy was less experienced in open water, so he did something counterintuitive. He opened the doors. He lured the massive enemy fleet into the narrow, treacherous channels of the Nile mouths, where the currents are unpredictable and the banks are close enough to touch. As the enemy ships entered the river branches, they found themselves in a natural trap. The tall reeds on either side were not empty. They were packed with thousands of Egyptian archers, hidden in the mud and shadows. On the decks of the Egyptian galleys, more bowmen stood ready. At a single signal, the sky over the delta turned black. It was not a storm of rain, but a storm of arrows, thousands upon thousands of bronze-tipped shafts falling in rhythmic, lethal volleys. The sea peoples, crowded onto their sailing vessels, had no room to maneuver. Their ships were built for wind and sail, but in the stagnant air of the river channels, they were sitting ducks. The Egyptians used long, heavy grappling hooks to snag the rigging of the enemy boats, pulling them toward the shore or simply capsizing them into the murky depths. The sounds of that day would have been haunting. The splintering of cedar wood, the splashes of men in heavy bronze armor sinking into the riverbed, and the constant, rhythmic thrum of bowstrings. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show a scene of absolute carnage. Enemies are depicted upside down, drifting in the water like fallen leaves. Rameses claimed that not a single one of those who reached his boundary would ever see their home again. He described them as being dragged and overturned, made into heaps of dead from stern to bow. It was the first great naval battle recorded in human history, and it was a total victory for the pharaoh. The immediate threat was neutralized. The borders were held. The sun continued to rise over a sovereign Egypt, while the rest of the world's palaces lay in ash. But the cost of this victory was a poison that would slowly seep through the veins of the empire. To fund this massive defense, Rameses had emptied the royal granaries and exhausted the treasury. The climate catastrophe that had driven the sea peoples to his shores did not spare Egypt entirely. The Nile's floods were becoming erratic, and the grain harvests were failing. For the first time in history, we see records of a labor strike. The tomb builders at Deir el-Medina laid down their tools because their rations of grain and oil had not been delivered. The high cost of the Delta defense had bought Egypt time, but it had also shattered its economic stability. The wall of metal had held against the invaders, but it could not hold against the slow, grinding reality of a world that was simply running out of resources. In the decades that followed, the new kingdom began to fray at the edges. The once mighty pharaohs were now presiding over a landscape of rising prices, internal conspiracies, and a military that could no longer be paid in silver or wheat. Even Rameses himself would eventually fall victim to a harem conspiracy, a plot born of the very instability his wars had tried to prevent. Egypt had survived the catastrophe of the 1200s, but it emerged as a shadow of its former self. As you drift closer to sleep, think of those stone reliefs in the desert, the silent images of ships and arrows. They tell a story of a kingdom that won every battle, yet lost the war against a changing planet. The victory was complete, yet the silence that followed was the beginning of the end. The embers have finally cooled. For decades, the smoke of the great palatial centers of the Mediterranean had colored the sunsets a bruised, heavy purple, but now, even that has faded. We find ourselves standing in the year 1200 before Common Era, or perhaps a few decades later, where the air is unnervingly still. The once bustling halls of Mycenae and the high, fortified walls of Hattusa are no longer filled with the sound of heralds or the smell of roasting meat for a king's table. Instead, there is only the rhythmic chirp of crickets and the rustle of dry weeds pushing through the cracks in the limestone. This is the beginning of what historians call the Century of Silence. It is a long, dark hibernation, a time when the world seemed to pull a heavy blanket over its head and wait for the fever of collapse to break. Perhaps the most eerie aspect of this new world is the death of the written word. For centuries, the scribes had been the silent pulse of civilization. In the palace of Pylos, they had sat in small rooms, pressing their reeds into wet clay to record every jar of olive oil, every fleece of wool, and every bronze sword in the king's armory. They used a complex script we now call Linear B, a system of signs that held the entire machinery of the state together. But when the palaces burned, the scribes had nowhere to go. Their art was a fragile thing, tied entirely to the high walls and the complex bureaucracy of the elite. When the kings fell, the reason for writing vanished. Within 2 generations, the ability to read those marks on clay was gone. The archives were buried under layers of ash, and the sons of the scribes became farmers who forgot that their fathers ever knew how to make the clay speak. The landscape itself begins to shift, becoming a map of ghosts. The great international highways, once crowded with caravans carrying lapis lazuli from the east and amber from the north, are reclaimed by the earth. Without the labor of thousands to maintain them, the stones settle and the dust swallows the ruts of the chariot wheels. Cities that once housed thousands are reduced to a few dozen families huddled in the ruins, or more often, they are abandoned completely. People move to the hills, seeking the safety of high, craggy slopes where they can see trouble coming from a distance. The grand, multi-storied houses with their vibrant frescoes of dolphins and charging bulls are replaced by simple, one-room huts made of mud and thatch. The vibrant blue pigments and the gold leaf disappear from the artist's palette, replaced by the humble, earthy brown of local clay. In this isolation, the very texture of life changes. The secret of bronze, that beautiful alloy of copper and tin, begins to fade. Tin was always a traveler's metal, brought from faraway mines across treacherous seas. Now that the trade routes have snapped like brittle thread, the smiths can no longer find the ingredients. They turn instead to a stubborn, difficult metal that had once been a rare luxury: iron. It is a metal of the Dark Ages, harder to work but found in the local earth. The shimmering, golden hue of the Bronze Age gives way to the gray, utilitarian strength of iron. It is a symbol of the shift from a world of luxury and interconnection to a world of survival and self-reliance. Every village becomes an island, and the horizon, which once stretched to the ends of the known world, now ends at the next ridge of hills. Time itself seems to stretch and blur during these 400 years of quiet. Without records, the memory of the past begins to transform into something different. The people living in the shadow of the great Mycenaean walls look up at the massive stones, some weighing many tons, and they cannot imagine that mere men built them. They begin to tell stories of the Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants who must have heaved the blocks into place. The real kings of the past, men with names and tax records, fade away, replaced by the gleaming heroes of myth. The Trojan War, the wanderings of lost captains, and the deeds of demigods become the only history the people have left. It is an oral history, sung by firelight, changing with every telling. The truth is no longer written in stone or clay. It is carried in the breath of the storytellers, drifting through the dark like wood smoke. This long hibernation is not just a period of loss, but a period of profound rest for a planet that had been overfarmed and exhausted. The pollen records from this time tell a story of forests slowly returning to the hillsides. The soil, no longer pushed to produce massive surpluses for demanding palaces, begins to recover its strength. The population is small, perhaps only a fraction of what it was during the peak of the New Kingdom or the Mycenaean era, but those who remain are resilient. They are the descendants of the survivors, the ones who learned to live without the palace, without the scribe, and without the king. They are waiting in the silence, though they do not know it, for a new kind of light to dawn. The world is dark, yes, but it is a fertile darkness, where the seeds of the next great age are beginning to stir beneath the cold, quiet earth. Record, once a silent witness, began to speak through the tireless efforts of a new kind of detective. We must leave the sun-scorched ruins of the palaces behind for a moment, moving away from the broken pottery and the charred remains of ancient walls. To find the smoking gun of this planetary mystery, we have to look deeper, into the very skin of the Earth itself. Scientists began to realize that while human records can be burned or lost to time, the environment keeps its own ledger, one written in the language of molecules and microscopic dust. This transition from traditional archaeology to the high-tech world of paleoclimatology changed everything. It shifted our gaze from what the people said happened to what the planet actually did. It was a journey into the quiet, muddy archives found at the bottom of ancient lakes and the dripping darkness of limestone caves. Imagine a team of researchers standing on a quiet platform in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. The air is still, and the water is a mirror reflecting the pale sky. They are not looking for shipwrecks, but for history buried in the silt. They drive a long, hollow steel tube deep into the soft floor of the lake, pulling up a vertical core of mud that spans thousands of years. This sediment is like a book, where each layer of muck represents a different century. As they sliced these cores open in the laboratory, they found the first undeniable clue. Within the mud were billions of grains of fossilized pollen. These tiny specks are nearly indestructible because of a substance called sporopollenin, a biological armor that protects the plant's genetic code for millennia. Under the microscope, these grains became the fingerprints of an entire ecosystem that had vanished long ago. By counting these grains every 40 years of the timeline, the researchers noticed a terrifying shift. Around 1250 years before the Common Era, the pollen of the lush Mediterranean forests began to vanish. The golden dust of the oak trees, the pines, and the highly prized carob trees started to disappear from the record. In their place, the soil began to fill with the pollen of hardy, desert-loving shrubs and dry grasses. Even the olive trees, the lifeblood of the Bronze Age economy, showed a staggering decline. This was not a seasonal change or a minor dry spell. It was the biological signature of a landscape that was literally dying of thirst. The plants were giving up, replaced by the flora of the wasteland. It was the first hard evidence that the climate had turned hostile, but the scientists needed one more piece of proof to confirm the severity. That proof waited in the eternal night of caves like Mavri Tripa in the southwestern Peloponnese. Here, away from the wind and the sun, the stalagmites grow with agonizing slowness, rising from the cave floor like pillars of frozen time. Each millimeter of stone is formed by the slow drip of rainwater filtering through the limestone above. This water carries a chemical memory of the atmosphere. Specifically, it carries isotopes of oxygen. Paleoclimatologists look for the ratio between oxygen-18 and oxygen-16. Oxygen-18 is heavier, and when the world turns hot and dry, the lighter oxygen-16 evaporates more quickly from the soil and the seas. This leaves the rainwater enriched with the heavier isotope. As these drops fell onto the stalagmites 3,000 years ago, they locked that heavy chemical signature into the crystal structure of the stone, creating a permanent thermometer of the ancient world. When the scientists analyzed the stalagmite known as S1, the data was chillingly clear. Just as the pollen counts were dropping in the lakes, the oxygen isotopes in the cave were spiking. The chemistry of the stone confirmed a period of extreme aridity that lasted for over 150 years. This was the smoking gun in the soil. It proved that the droughts were not localized events, but part of a massive, regional catastrophe that gripped the entire eastern Mediterranean. The water that fed the great rivers and the mountain springs was simply gone. The precision of this science allowed us to see that the collapse of the palaces did not happen in a vacuum. It happened because the very foundation of life, the rain and the soil, had been withdrawn. The high-resolution data showed a world that had been pushed past its breaking point by a mega-drought of unprecedented proportions. The synthesis of the pollen and the isotopes told a story that no ancient scribe could have fully captured. It was the story of a systemic failure. As the forests withered and the isotopes shifted, the social order began to fray. The grain shortages led to civil unrest, which led to the movement of desperate people, which led to the wars we have studied in the ruins. But the root cause was always there, hidden in the microscopic grains and the heavy atoms of the rain. We now know that the climate was not just a background character in this drama, it was the primary culprit. The soil had held this secret for 3 millennia, waiting for us to develop the tools to read it. As we look at these chemical graphs today, we realize that the end of the Bronze Age was a warning from the earth itself. A silent scream captured in mud and stone that we are only now beginning to hear. The synthesis of the pollen and the isotopes told a story that no ancient scribe could have fully captured. It was the story of a systemic failure. As we step deeper into the evidence, we find ourselves in the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of Queen's University in Belfast. Here, the air carries the faint, sweet scent of damp wood and aged resin. Rows of dark, heavy timber sections rest on metal shelves, salvaged from the deep, oxygen-free embrace of Irish peat bogs. These are the bog oaks. To a casual observer, they are merely ancient remains, but to the dendrochronologist, they are the most precise clocks ever wound by nature. Each slice of wood contains a sequence of rings, a biological diary that records the character of every single year. When the sun is warm and the rain is gentle, the tree grows thick and strong, adding a wide, healthy band of pale wood. But when the world turns cold and the sky grows dim, the tree's very heartbeat slows, leaving behind a narrow, pinched line that speaks of struggle and starvation. Professor Mike Bailey spent decades meticulously overlapping these patterns, matching the end of one tree's life to the beginning of another, until he had forged a continuous chain of time stretching back thousands of years. But as he worked through the records of the 6th century, he encountered something truly startling. In the year 536, the rings did not just narrow, they practically vanished. In some specimens, the growth was so minimal it was nearly impossible to see without a microscope. This was not a localized drought or a passing storm. As Bailey compared his Irish oaks to pine chronologies from the high mountains of Sweden and the ancient bristlecone pines of the American West, the same chilling signature appeared. From the frozen reaches of Siberia to the peaks of the Sierra Nevada, the trees of the entire northern hemisphere had collectively gasped for air. The verdict of the rings was unanimous. The mid-6th century had endured a climatic trauma of such magnitude that it had no modern parallel. Under the lens of a microscope, the wood from 536 reveals a specialized kind of horror. Usually, a tree begins its growing season by producing large, open vessels to transport water quickly. These are the spring vessels. As summer progresses, the cells become smaller and denser. But in the wood of that fateful year, the spring vessels are tiny, stunted things. They are often followed by what scientists call frost rings, distorted, crushed cells where the sap literally froze inside the living tissue during the height of what should have been a warm summer. The trees were being choked by a persistent, unnatural chill. This biological evidence confirmed the whispers of the ancient historians who wrote of a year where the sun gave no more heat than the moon. But while the rings proved that the catastrophe happened, they could not easily explain why. For a long time, the scientific community looked toward the polar ice for the final piece of the puzzle, searching for the chemical fingerprints that only a global disaster could leave behind. Deep within the Greenland ice sheet, researchers from the Greenland Ice Sheet Project drilled miles into the frozen crust, pulling up cylinders of ice that contain trapped bubbles of ancient atmosphere. Each layer of ice represents a single year of snowfall, compressed over centuries into a transparent archive. When they reached the layers corresponding to the mid-6th century, they found an unmistakable spike in sulfate concentrations. These are the chemical remains of volcanic acid, launched high into the stratosphere where it forms a reflective veil of aerosols. For years, however, there was a frustrating mystery. The dates in the ice cores seemed to be off by about 7 years, placing the massive volcanic signals just slightly away from the narrowest tree rings. It was a tension that divided researchers. Was it a comet, or was the ice core dating simply slightly askew? The breakthrough finally arrived in 2015, when a massive international effort recalibrated the ice core chronologies using cosmic ray markers and historical accounts of known eruptions. Once that 7-year error was corrected, the two records locked together like the teeth of a gear. The sulfate spike in the ice now aligned perfectly with the year 536. This revealed that the catastrophe was not a single event, but a rapid-fire succession of volcanic hammer blows. The first eruption, likely occurring in the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere, perhaps in Iceland or Alaska, spewed a massive cloud of ash that blanketed the sun for 18 months. But before the planet could recover, a second, even more powerful eruption occurred in 540. This second blast, often linked to the Ilopango volcano in what is now El Salvador, was a tropical eruption that sent sulfur high enough to cross the equator and shroud both hemispheres. The tree rings show that while 536 was the beginning of the nightmare, the year 541 was often the coldest point of all. The scientific certainty was now absolute. The world had been plunged into a volcanic winter that lasted for nearly 15 years. The verdict was finally in. The trees had remembered the cold, and the ice had preserved the poison. Together, they tell us that for a child born in the year 530, the prime of their life would have been spent in a twilight world of failed harvests and biting frosts. The global temperature dropped by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius, a shift so sudden that ecosystems simply could not adapt. This was the scientific foundation of the catastrophe, a planet-wide dimming that turned the fertile valleys of the Mediterranean and the wheat fields of China into desolate, frozen landscapes. As we sit here in the warmth of the present, it is humbling to think that the proof of this apocalypse was hidden for 1,500 years in the silent rings of an old oak at the bottom of a bog. The evidence is no longer a matter of interpretation. It is written in the very chemistry of the earth. The sky did go dark, the sun did fail, and the world as they knew it began to end. The wind that sweeps across the central Anatolian plateau today carries a specific, heavy kind of silence. It whistles through the gaps in the stones of the Lion Gate, where two great feline sentinels have stood for over 3,000 years. They guard a city that is no longer there. Hattusa, the once glittering capital of the Hittite Empire, was not always a place of dust and ruins. At its peak, it was a sprawling metropolis of over 15,000 people, protected by massive stone walls and powered by a bureaucracy that rivaled even the great pharaohs of Egypt. But the story of its end is not one of a sudden, bloody conquest. It is a story of a slow, agonizing transformation from a cradle of civilization into a ghost of the plateau. We have spent this investigation looking for the culprit behind the Great Bronze Age collapse, and here, in the heart of modern Turkey, the evidence has finally spoken. It speaks through the very earth itself, and through the ghosts of trees that lived and breathed when the Hittite kings still walked these halls. In 2023, a breakthrough emerged from the Cornell Tree Ring Laboratory, led by Professor Sturt Manning. The evidence didn't come from a new excavation of a palace or a lost temple, but from the Midas Mound tumulus at Gordian, about 200 kilometers west of Hattusa. Inside this massive man-made hill lies a burial chamber constructed from ancient logs of juniper. These trees are incredible biological recorders. They grow slowly, and for a species like the juniper, they can live for centuries, etching the history of the world's climate into their inner rings. Manning and his team looked at 18 different logs, analyzing over 1,500 individual rings. They weren't just looking at the width of the wood, but at the carbon isotopes trapped within the fibers. When a tree is thirsty, when the sky refuses to open and the soil turns to stone, it undergoes a specific kind of stress that changes its chemistry. The rings begin to narrow, growing closer and closer together, as if the tree is bracing itself against the end of the world. The data revealed a terrifying pattern. The Hittite Empire had been born around 1650 before Common Era and had survived hundreds of years of minor droughts and shifting seasons. They were masters of resilience. They built enormous underground grain silos, some of the largest ever found in the ancient world, designed to hold enough food to keep their people fed through a bad year or even two. But the tree rings told a story of something far worse than a bad season. Between the years 1198 and 1196 before Common Era, the climate of Anatolia didn't just become dry, it became hostile. For 3 consecutive years, the rains simply vanished. 1 year of drought was a challenge. 2 years were a crisis. But 3 years in a row, that was a catastrophe that no amount of planning could survive. The wheat failed. The barley turned to dust in the fields. The great silos, once the pride of the empire, began to show their empty stone bottoms. Imagine the atmosphere in the royal court during that 3rd year of drought, 1196 before Common Era. The last known king, Suppiluliuma II, would have looked out from the high walls of Hattusa toward a horizon that offered no relief. The clouds were empty. The rivers were trickling into nothingness. This wasn't just a lack of water, it was the collapse of the social contract. The Hittite state was built on the collection of grain as taxes and the distribution of that grain to maintain a massive army and a complex priesthood. When the grain failed, the tax base vanished. Without food, the soldiers could not be fed, and they began to desert their posts. The common people, facing starvation, began to move. This is the echo of Hattusa, a migration of the desperate. They weren't being chased by an invading army of sea peoples. They were being chased by the sun and the hunger in their own bellies. Archaeology shows us that the end of Hattusa was curiously peaceful and yet deeply tragic. There are no signs of a city being taken by storm, no piles of arrowheads, no mass graves of fallen defenders. Instead, it seems the royal court simply packed up their most precious belongings and left. They abandoned their capital, leaving behind the massive stone lions and the thousands of clay tablets that recorded their laws and their legends. Once the city was empty, it was set on fire, perhaps by those who remained or by passing groups of looters. But the fire was just a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence that had already been written by the drought. The empire didn't fall, it evaporated. The sophisticated systems that had held central Anatolia together for 5 centuries were proven to be fragile threads when pulled by the fingers of a changing climate. As we look back at the 3,200-year-old trees that gave up these secrets, it is hard not to hear the resonance in our own time. The researchers who uncovered this drought noted that the Hittites were a highly organized, resilient society, and yet they were undone by a sequence of events they couldn't control. It reminds us that our modern world, with all its technology and infrastructure, still rests upon a foundation of environmental stability. The echo of Hattusa is a whisper from the past, telling us that civilization is a fragile garden. But tonight, that garden is still green. The ruins of the plateau are far away, and the dry winds of 1198 before Common Era have long since been replaced by the steady, rhythmic breath of the present. You are here in the safety of the now, where the stories of the past can no longer touch you. The stone lions still stand guard, but they watch over a history that is finished, leaving you free to rest. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.